Welcome back to the Simulator series. In today's episode, we are going to be creating the click animation. Now, hopping directly into Studio, the first thing that we're going to do is create the GUI. Now, since last time we have been creating GUIs a little bit differently, so we first are going to go to the test tab, then we're going to click on the device emulation, and I'm going to select the HD 1080 device to emulate my screen size to. And now that we've done that, we can actually go ahead and create the GUI. So inside of the starter GUI, we're going to create a brand new screen GUI. Now, we're going to rename the screen GUI to be called click. Then, taking a look at its properties, we want to set the ignore GUI inset property to true, and we want to set reset on spawn to false. Then we'll go ahead and add a frame to the screen GUI. Now, this frame is going to be used for displaying our currency pop-ups. Now, how the currency pop-ups are going to work is basically whenever the player earns clicks, this pop-up, which displays the amount of clicks that the player has earned along with a click icon, will be displayed randomly on the screen. Now, although we're displaying it randomly on the screen, realistically, we only want it to appear in specific locations. Like, for instance, we wouldn't really want the pop-up to appear over top of any of our other GUIs on either the left or the right or the top or the bottom even. So with this frame, we need to sort of create a safe zone for where we actually do want those currency pop-ups to appear. So with my mouse, I'm just going to drag this around a little bit, and then I'm also going to go ahead and resize this. Now, I think that sizing is looking pretty good. What we're effectively doing is keeping this frame at a decent size so that it doesn't overlap or even touch any of our other GUIs that we can clearly see right now. Now let's go ahead and adjust its positioning. Of course, we want it to be centered on the screen. So for the anchor point, we're going to set both of those to 0.5, and then for the position on both the scales, we're going to set those to 0.5 as well. And now that is centered perfectly. With that being said though, I want to make two adjustments to this. First of all, on the left side, we can clearly see that this is actually touching one of our currency labels. So let's go ahead and decrease the size a little bit right there. And then let's move it towards the right a little bit because we do have some spacing available for us right there as well. Now, if we look towards the bottom, it's getting a little bit too close to those clicking buttons, so I'm going to drag it up a tiny bit. And then towards the top, we also have some room left up there as well, so let's go ahead and just make it a little bit taller. And now I think both the sizing and positioning of this is good to go. So inside of this frame, we're going to go ahead and create a canvas group. We have used a canvas group in the past, but if you forgot about that or you didn't watch that episode, a canvas group can be thought of pretty similarly to a frame. Although it's a little bit hard to see here because the background colors are actually the exact same color. If we move it out a little bit, we can see that a default canvas group appears identical to a frame. The reason that we're using a canvas group instead of a frame though, is because a canvas group actually has a couple of different properties, like group color and group transparency. Now, we really only care about the group transparency property because how the animation is going to work is the currency display is going to pop up on the screen. We'll use a little tween to move it a little bit. And then at the end, we want to use another tween to adjust its transparency to kind of make it fade out. Of course, we could do this with just a normal frame. If we used a normal frame though, we would have to loop through all of the children inside of that frame and adjust their transparency accordingly. But if we use a canvas group, we don't need to do that. All we actually have to do is adjust the group transparency property, and that'll adjust the transparency of everything inside of it. So it just makes it so much easier for us on the scripting end of things. But again, it can be thought of as pretty much just a basic normal frame for the most part. Anyways, with all that being said, what we're going to do is we're actually going to rename this canvas group to be called amount. Then let's go ahead and resize it. So for the size on the X offset, I'm going to go with 150, and I want to make it a little bit less tall, so on the Y offset, we're going to go with 50. Then inside of the canvas group, we're going to go ahead and create an image label. We're going to rename this image label to be called icon BG, BG of course standing for background, and then let's go ahead and update the image. And the image that we actually want to use is our rebirth icon small background. Now we want to go ahead and adjust the scale type property of this image label to be fit, and then let's go ahead and resize this. Now on the Y scale, we're going to set that to 1 because we want it to be the entire height of the parent canvas group. And for the size on the X-axis, we're actually going to adjust the offset from being 100 to being 50. Cool. And now I think that icon is looking pretty good. The next thing that we're going to do is duplicate this image label, and we're actually going to drag it inside of itself. Then we'll go ahead and rename this image label to be called icon. And inside of here, we're going to update the image. And we're going to set this to the clicks boost icon. Oh, that actually made me realize something. We need to adjust the background transparency of both of these to 1 so that we do not see their background. Going back to the icon image label though, let's go ahead and resize it. For the size of this on both the X and the Y scale, we're actually going to go with 0.5. Then for the position and the anchor point, we want to set both of those to 0.5 because we want to center it as well. So let's go ahead and say 0.5, 0.5, and now that's centered and resized. And I think that's looking pretty good. Now that we have the icon all set up, the next thing that we want to do is create the text label for displaying how much currency the player actually received. So let's go ahead and create a text label, and we'll rename this to be called amount. Then for the text of this, we'll say something like plus 99.999M. For the text color, we're actually going to go with a white. For the text size, we're going to go with about 24. And for the text X alignment, we want to go with the left. Then let's go ahead and adjust the font. Of course, we want to set the font to Gotham. And we want to make sure that the background transparency is set to 1 so that we do not see that. Now, of course, because I did set the text to be white, it's pretty much impossible to see. So let me go ahead and throw a UI stroke inside of here. And for the thickness of the stroke, we're going to set that to 2. Now, inside of the canvas group, we want to go ahead and add a UI list layout to this. For the UI list layout, we want to set the fill direction from vertical to horizontal. And now we can see them side by side. We probably also want to add some padding as well. So for the padding offset, we're going to set that to 3 to give it just a little bit of spacing. Now, going back to the amount text label, I actually want to modify the font a little bit. And I think I want to set this to bold. The next thing I want to do is set the background transparency of the canvas group to 1 because we don't want that white background there at all. Now that we can kind of see how this is actually going to look, we can actually see that some of this text is hanging off of the screen. Now, there's a couple of different things that we could do to kind of handle this. First of all, we could limit the amount of characters that we're going to put inside of the text label. So right now, if we're saying plus, that's 1, then 99, that's 3, then we have the period, that makes 4, then 999, that makes 7, and then we have M, which is 8. One thing we could do is not include all of the decimals. Maybe we only include 2 decimals, or maybe we only include a single decimal. Alternatively, we could include no decimals. If we include no decimals, then that takes us down to only 4 characters. And we can clearly see that 4 characters fits perfectly fine on here. But let's go back to having 2 decimal places, for example. When we have 2 decimal places, that looks perfectly fine as well. The text no longer extends past where we can actually see it. Now, alternatively, if we wanted to include more characters in the text, what we could do is we could decrease the text size. And as we decrease the text size, that allows us to fit more text inside of there without going out of bounds. And of course, alternatively, if this was a little bit bigger and it does actually stretch off the screen, another thing that we could do is actually resize the canvas group to accommodate for that text as well. So now we can see that when I did change the sizing of the canvas group, the text label can display a couple of extra characters. So those are a couple of different options that you have for setting up your text. Now I'm going to revert that. So I'm going to go back to the original sizing of 150 on the X offset. And for the amount text label, I'm going to go to only about 2 decimal places, just like that. Anyways, with all that being said, we're pretty much done with creating this canvas group. If we want to, we could modify the position of it to make it appear like in the middle of the screen. If we wanted to, realistically, it doesn't matter because we are going to reposition this when it comes to scripting and everything like that. But anyways, what I'm going to do is go ahead and set the visibility of this to false. And then for our frame, I want to actually modify the background transparency to 1 because we don't actually want to see the frame. Again, it's just a safe zone for where we can position the amount canvas group. And with that being said, we are done with that frame. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is inside of the screen GUI, we want to add another frame. And we're going to rename this frame to be called clicks. Now, this frame is going to be used for whenever the player actually taps or clicks on the screen. Wherever the player actually clicks or taps, we want to just display a couple of currency icons and animate it to make all of those icons kind of drift away from where the player actually clicked to just add a little animation and make it look a little cooler. Now, when it comes to scripting and handling this frame, it's going to work a little bit similar to our amount canvas group. The thing is with this clicks frame though, is that we don't actually care about having a safe zone. The reason for that is because we want this to appear wherever the player actually clicks. And we don't mind if the player is clicking close to the currency label or the buttons or anything like that, we still want to make this appear in that area. Now that we have some sort of understanding of how we're going to use this, let's go ahead and resize this. And I just want to increase the size of this a tiny bit. So I'm going to set both the X and the Y offset to 150 instead of 100. Next, what I'm going to do is add an image label inside of here, and I'm going to rename this to be called click. Now for the image of this, we're going to use that same currency icon that we just used, so the clicks boost icon. We're going to set the background transparency of this to 1, and then let's go ahead and adjust the scale type to fit. Then let's go ahead and resize this as well, and I'm going to actually set this to 30 on both the X and the Y offset. Now it might be hard to see because it is a little bit small right there, but it is there. And we're actually pretty much done with this entire thing. The last thing that we want to do though is we actually want to set the background transparency of the clicks frame to 1 so that we don't see that. And then we want to set the visibility of the click image label to false so that we don't see that as well. Keep in mind though that we want to make sure that both of these frames do remain visible. And we also want to make sure that our screen GUI remains enabled as well. Now, with that being said, we're pretty much done with creating this entire GUI. The last thing that we need to do, though, is we need to add our UI scale to it like we've added in the last episode to all of our other GUIs. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this UI scale and paste that directly into the screen GUI. And now that we've done that, we're all good to go. So we can go ahead and collapse the starter GUI because we're done with creating the GUIs. Now we can begin scripting this GUI. So we're going to go inside of the starter player, inside of the starter player scripts, and inside of the GUI folder. Inside of here, we're going to go ahead and create a module script, and we're going to rename this module script to be called click. Of course, we'll rename the module variable from being called module to being called click, just like that. Now, towards the top of our script, we want to create some variables for a couple of different services. First, we want to get the player service. Then we want to get the replicated storage. Then we want to get the tween service. Then the user input service. And finally, we want to get the workspace. Now, from the replicated storage, we do need to require a couple of different modules. So we want to go ahead and require the format number module, as well as the state manager. In addition to that, we of course also want to create a variable for the remotes folder. And now we can start creating our player variables as well as the standard GUI variables. So we'll go ahead and create a variable for our local player as well as the player GUI. Then we'll create a variable for the GUI itself, and that's inside of the player GUI, and we want to use wait for child, and we want to wait for the click GUI to appear if it's not already there. Then let's go ahead and create a variable for its frame. So of course GUI.frame. Then we'll create a variable for the amount group. So we would say frame.amount. And then we want to create a variable for the clicks frame. And that's inside of the GUI, so GUI.clicks. Okay, cool. Now that we have all those variables, the first thing that we're going to do is create a function for handling the animation behind whenever a player receives clicks. So not when the player is clicking, but when they're actually rewarded clicks. That could be both from actually clicking or from completing quests and doing different things like that. So we're going to create a local function here, which is going to be called Animate Clicks Earned, And it's going to have a single parameter, which is going to be called amount, and that would be a number. Now, before we even create this function, we can quickly hook it up to give you more insight into how we'll actually be using this. And we're going to be hooking this function up to a remote event. So we're going to say remotes, and the remote event that we're going to be hooking this function up to is actually the update clicks remote event. So we'll say .onClient event, then we'll use :connect, and we'll connect that to the Animate Clicks Earned function. So this function is going to run anytime the update clicks remote event is fired. And the first thing that we want to do inside of here is determine how many clicks the player had previously. So we're going to create a variable called previous clicks. And how we're going to determine the player's previous clicks is we're going to be using the state manager. Now, you might be confused by this because in our state manager, we actually listen to the update clicks remote event as well, and then we update the player's data based on this number. But hopefully you remember that usually every single time that we make an update to a GUI based on a remote event being fired, we generally use task.delay with 0 delay. And the reason for that is because we want to make sure that the state manager actually updates everything, and then when our GUI updates, it has the modified data, and it's not updating with previous or the old data before it actually has been updated. So here though, we're not using any task.delay. So that means that when we use the state manager and get the value from there, that value will basically be the old data. So we're going to say state manager.getData. And what do we want to get? We want to go ahead and get the clicks. Then we'll go ahead and create a variable, which is going to be called didEarnClicks. Because again, we only want to make this animation appear if the player has actually gained clicks. Now, how can we determine if the player earned clicks or not? Well, the amount argument would be greater than the previous clicks variable. So now, if the player did not earn any clicks, then we don't want to do anything. So we're going to say if not did earn clicks, then return end. Now, if we make it this far down, then we know that the player did actually earn the clicks, so we want to handle all of the animation logic. First, let's go ahead and create a variable to determine how many clicks the player has earned. So this variable is going to be called clicks earned. And to determine how many clicks the player has actually earned, we're going to subtract the previous amount of clicks the player had from the new amount of clicks that the player has. And we're not going to use that right this second, but we will use it very shortly. So now what we want to do is we actually want to go ahead and create a clone of our amount canvas group. So we're going to create a variable called clone, and then we're going to say amount group, and we're going to clone that. Then we want to make sure that we parent it to the frame that it was already inside of. So we're going to say clone.parent equals frame, and then we want to make sure that it is visible. After we make it visible to the player, the next thing that we want to do is go ahead and update the amount text label. So we're going to say clone.amount.text, and we're going to set the text to plus. Then after the plus, we want to actually display the amount of clicks that the player earned. But we're going to use the format number.formatCompact on this, and then we're going to go ahead and pass through the clicks earned. So now we've updated the amount text label. The next thing that we're going to do is actually position the clone. Now, we're going to create two variables here. So we're going to say local random x, then we'll use a comma, and we'll say random y. Then for the value of this, we're going to actually use math.random. So we're going to say math.random, and this is going to generate a number between 0 and 1 if we don't pass any arguments to it. And that's perfectly fine because we do actually want a number between 0 and 1. Then after that, we'll use a comma and we'll say math.random once again. But this time, we are going to add 0.1 for the random y. The reason for this is because how our animation is going to work is we actually want to tween the position and the anchor point to make the canvas group sort of animate in an upwards direction. So right here, we're adding 0.1 to the y. And then when we actually tween or animate it, we will subtract 0.1 from the y. So it kind of gives us a little bit of room to perform our animation. Now that we've come up with the random position for where we want to actually position this, what we're going to do is adjust the position and the anchor point. So we're going to say clone.position equals, then we'll create a udim2.fromScale because we're using scale instead of offset for the position. And that's why when we're generating the random x and y, we're generating a number between 0 and 1 because, of course, that's what scale uses. So then, of course, we'll specify our random x, and then we'll say our random y, and then we'll adjust the anchor point as well. So we'll say clone.anchorPoint equals, now this actually requires a vector2, so we'll say vector2.new, and then we'll pass through the random x and the random y, just like that. So now we've made it visible, we've updated the text, and we've even positioned it as well. So for the most part, we're pretty much done with this, but now we actually have to animate it and make it look pretty cool. So we're going to create a variable called tweenInfo, which is going to be equal to tweenInfo.new. For the time, we want this to take up about 1 second. For the easing style, we're actually going to use quint because we want this to start at a high speed. And now for the easing direction, we're actually going to use out. Next, we're going to create a variable called tweenProperties, and that's going to be equal to a blank table. Now, this is going to be a little bit odd, but I think this makes writing tween code look a lot cleaner, and you'll see why in a second. So with the tweens properties table, what I do is I just store whatever properties I want to modify of whatever we're tweening inside of here. So for example, we're going to say tween properties, then we'll say period. And now we want to tween both the position and the anchor point. So we'll go ahead and start off with the position. And now where do we want to tween the position to? Well, we're going to use a udim2 again. We'll say dot from scale. And now we don't want to modify the x at all. So we'll say random x. And then we'll say random y. But now, like I said earlier, we now want to subtract from the random y. So we're going to say minus 0.1. So now we've stored that property inside of the tween properties table. Then we're going to do the same thing for the anchor point. So we're going to say tweenProperties.anchorPoint, and now this is going to be a vector2. And again, we'll say random x, random y, minus 0.1, because we pretty much always want to keep the anchor point and the position exactly the same. So when you see us doing pretty much the same thing for both of them, that's intended. Okay, now that we've done that, we're going to go ahead and create a variable called tween. In order to create this, we're going to use the tween service because it has a method called create. Now for the first parameter, we want to pass through the instance, which is going to be the clone. Then we need to pass through the tween info. And then finally, we need to pass through the property table. Now, normally how people do this is they create a table inside of here, and then they actually specify each of the specific properties. So you would say position, and then you would set that equal to this position that you want to tween it to. But instead of doing that, we already created the table called tween properties. So we're just going to pass it through just like that. And again, this might appear a little bit unusual, but I saw this at one point and I just felt like it looked a whole lot better to create the table beforehand and then just pass through that variable rather than creating all of that inside of where we actually create the tween variable. Of course, you can do it either way, however you prefer. This is just a different method, and I think it's always beneficial to see how you can do one thing a bunch of different ways. Anyways, now that we've created that tween, we're going to go ahead and actually play it. So that tween will reposition and move around the canvas group. We also want to create an additional tween, and this tween will actually be used to make the icon inside of it rotate. So we're going to create a variable called iconTween, which is going to be equal to tweenService, create. This time though, we're going to pass through clone.iconbg, and inside of there, we want to get the actual icon image label. Then for the tween info, we're just going to pass through the same tween info. And now, rather than creating the table beforehand, I'm actually just going to go ahead and create it inside of here. And the property that we want to adjust is actually the rotation property. And we want to set that equal to the clone.iconbg.icon.rotation. And then we're going to add 360 to that. And now that we've created that icon tween, we're going to go ahead and play that as well. So we're going to say icon tween and play. Cool. So now we've gotten both tweens created and they will play. The last thing that we want to do is we want to wait for the primary tween to actually finish. And then once it's finished, we want to play another tween, which will make it fade away. And then we'll actually destroy it. So we're going to say tween.completed, connect, and then we'll create an anonymous function inside of here. And actually, we don't care about this parameter, so we can go ahead and just delete that. Anyways, inside of here is where we want to create that brand new fade tween. So we're going to create a variable called fade tween, which again, we're going to have to use the tween service for that. So we're going to say tween service, create, and now we're going to pass through the clone as the instance, which remember, the clone is actually a canvas group. So right here is where the canvas group is going to come in handy because we want to adjust its transparency. Anyways, for the tween info, we're actually going to create a new tween info. So we're actually going to say tween info, and all we're going to do is adjust the time, and we're going to actually set that to 0.5. Then for the properties that we want to tween, we actually want to modify the group transparency property, and we want to set that to 1. And once we adjust the group transparency property, that will adjust the transparency property of every single thing stored inside of it. So now that we've created that tween, let's go ahead and actually play it. And then we want to listen for that tween to be completed. So we'll go ahead and say .completed, connect that to an anonymous function. And now once the fade tween has finished, that's when we actually want to go ahead and destroy the clone. Oh man, I'm not sure if it's just me, but that felt like a lot. Creating tweens for some reason just feels like quite a lot of work. And this is a little bit random to say, but I kind of am not a fan of creating so many tweens in a single function or creating a tween inside of an anonymous function, listening for when a tween is completed. Of course, we could organize this code a little bit differently, but man, that just felt like so much. And yeah, but anyway, we're actually all good with that. Now remember, this is a module script. So in order for this module script to actually work, it needs to be required. So let's actually go ahead and require this module script before we start scripting the next part of it. Where are we going to require this module script? Well, it'll actually be inside of the starter player scripts, and it'll actually be inside of the click local script. Now, below our remotes variable, I'm going to create a variable called click GUI, which is going to be equal to require. Then we'll say script.parent, which will take us to the starter player scripts. But now we actually have to use wait for child, and we want to wait for the GUI folder to be created. And then we'll go ahead and require the click module script. Now I probably should have created the function inside of there that this script is going to use, but I'm not the best planner. So we'll actually just go ahead and use the imaginary function that we haven't created yet inside of here so that we just don't have to come back to this script after we create it. Anyways, after we fire off the click remote event, what we're going to do is we're going to use the clicks GUI module, and we're going to use a function which is going to be called Animate Click. And that function is not going to have any parameters, so we're not going to pass anything to it. Of course, you're going to have a red underscore here because we did not create the Animate Click function yet, but we're about to do that once we return back to the click module script. Anyway, if you couldn't tell yet, anytime the player clicks or taps or does anything like that inside of our game, it's going to fire the click remote event and will also animate their click as well. So returning back to our original click module script, if you haven't realized, what we want to do inside of here is we want to create a brand new function, which is going to be attached to our click table. So we're going to say function click, then dot, and now the name of the function is going to be called Animate Click. Now, the first thing that we want to do inside of this function is we actually want to get the position of the player's mouse. So the first thing that we're going to do is create a variable called mouse position. And to get the mouse position, we're going to use the user input service. And the method that we're going to use of the user input service is going to be get mouse location. After that, we're going to create a variable called screen size. Now, getting the mouse position is a big part of this. The second big part of this is actually calculating both the anchor point and the position. The reason for that is because the mouse position is given to us as an offset value. So get mouse location will return to us a vector 2. And if you were kind of imagining the position being of a GUI, that position is in offset and not scale. But now when it comes to actually positioning our GUI, we want to use scale rather than offset. So what we need to do is convert that position from offset over to scale. And how do we do that? Well, the first thing that we need to do is we need to get the size of the player screen. So we're going to create a variable called screen size, which is going to be equal to the workspace dot current camera. And of the current camera, it actually has a viewport size property, which, as the description says, describes the dimensions in pixels of the client's viewport. So that'll give us the actual screen size. And now we'll create a variable for both the X scale and the Y scale and convert the mouse position from scale to offset. So we're going to create a variable called X scale, which is going to be equal to the mouse position.x divided by screen size.x. Then we'll do the same thing for the Y axis. So we'll create a variable called Y scale and we'll divide the Y of the mouse position by the Y of the screen size. And now we've gotten both the X and the Y position converted over to scale, we can go ahead and adjust the anchor point and position of the clicks frame. So we're going to say clicks frame dot anchor point equals, then we'll use a vector 2 dot new, and we'll say X scale and Y scale. Then we'll adjust its position. So we'll say clicks frame dot position equals udim2 dot from scale, and then we'll pass through the X scale and the Y scale. Now, the next thing that we actually want to do is we want to make a clone of the clicks frame. The reason for this is because if we don't create a clone of the clicks frame, we're going to reposition the clicks frame every single time the player clicks. And while I was working on this animation, that's actually what I did at first. I was not originally cloning this, but you'll quickly realize that without cloning it and just repositioning it every single time the player clicks, the animation looks really scuffed. But if we clone it every single time and we allow each of those clicks to kind of fully complete their animation, it looks so much smoother. So we're going to create a variable called frame clone, which is going to be equal to the clicks frame. And then of course, we're going to go ahead and clone it. Then we want to go ahead and parent this to the GUI. Now we probably don't have to because we should have already been keeping all of these frames visible. But if for some reason you chose to make the frame not visible, we want to go ahead and make sure that we set the visibility of that back to true. And okay, here comes the interesting part. Inside of the clicks frame is that image label. And what we want to do with that image label is we want to duplicate that image label 4 different times. The reason for that is every time the player clicks, we want to basically have 4 icons appear around the player's mouse. So what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate that icon 4 different times, and then we're going to have each of the icons repositioned towards a specific corner. So we're going to have 4 icons. One icon's going to move to the top left, one to the top right, one to the bottom left, and one to the bottom right. So we're going to create a for loop, and this for loop's a little bit different than the one that we commonly use. We're not going to be iterating over a table. Instead, we want to iterate a specific amount of times. Now let me know in the comment section down below, is it just me, or every time you use a different for loop than the one that you would use for iterating through a table, I always forget how to create these and it always feels so weird. So in order to create this for loop, we're going to say for I equals 1. So we're going to start at 1, then we're going to use a comma, and then we'll say 4. And 4 is going to be the limit as to when this for loop will stop. And then we're just going to say do. So this is going to start at 1, and then once it gets to 4, it'll completely stop. So now, like I said, inside of this for loop, we want to go ahead and clone that image that's inside of the frame. So we're going to say local clone equals frame clone dot click, which is the image label, and then we're going to go ahead and clone that. Then, of course, we want to go ahead and parent that to the frame clone, and then we want to make that visible. So we're going to set the visibility of it to true. Then we're going to create a variable called target position. Now, if I equals 1, then the target position is going to be a vector2 dot new, and for the x and the y of this, we're going to set both of those to 0. Now, by setting those both to 0, that's going to make this move to the top left corner. Then we'll say else if I equals 2, and now we'll pretty much do the same thing. So let's actually just go ahead and copy and paste this. So now if I equals 2, then instead of setting the target position to 0, 0, we're actually going to set it to 1, 0. This will make it move to the top right corner. Now for the next else if, we're going to say if I equals 3, then we'll go ahead, copy and paste the target position just like that. And then we'll actually move this to 0, 1. So that would be the bottom left corner. Then finally, we'll say else, and then we'll set the target position to one final combination that we haven't used yet, which is going to be 1, 1. And that target position is actually at the bottom right corner. And now, after we determine the target position, we're actually going to use that target position and pass that to another function. So let's go ahead and create that function above this function. We're going to create a local function, which is going to be called Animate Clone to Position. That will accept the clone, which is going to be an instance, and it'll accept the position, which is going to be a vector2. Now, before we start creating this function, let's go back to Animate Click, and then we'll actually call this function. So we'll say Animate Clone to Position, we'll pass through the clone, and we'll pass through the target position as well. Now, one final thing, just to wrap up the entire Animate Click function so that we don't have to come back to here. After this for loop, what we want to do is we want to use a task.delay, and we want to wait 2 seconds. Because after 2 seconds, what we want to do is we want to destroy the frame clone. So we'll go ahead and say frame clone, and then destroy it. Okay, now going to the animate clone to position, and actually we can redefine this parameter. Instead of calling it an instance, we could actually be more specific and more correct. It's actually an image label. So to start off, we're going to go ahead and create a variable for the tween info. So we'll say tween info dot new. We want this to take up about 1 second. Then for the easing style, we are going to use quint. And then for the easing direction, we are going to use out. Then we'll go ahead and create a variable for our tween properties. So we'll set that variable equal to a table. And now we're actually going to add quite a few properties to this table. First, we want to modify both the position and the anchor point. So we're going to say tween properties dot position equals. Then we'll use a udim2 from scale, and then we'll say position.x and position.y. Then we'll adjust its anchor point. So we'll say tween properties.anchor point equals. This is going to be a vector2. So we'll say vector2.new. Again, pass through the position.x and the position.y. And now the other property that we want to adjust is also the image transparency. So we're going to say tween properties.image transparency. Make sure you spell that all correctly. And we want to tween that to 1 because we want to make it less visible as the animation goes on. Then finally, we're going to adjust the rotation property as well, because we actually want to make the icon rotate as the animation plays. Now, we want to make this feel a little bit natural, so we're going to actually add a little bit of randomness to this, and we're going to say math.random -360, 360. So it'll give us a number between -360 and 360. Now let's go ahead and actually create the tween. So we're going to say tween service :create. We'll pass through the clone, we'll pass through the tween info, and we'll pass through the tween properties as well. Now that we've created that tween, let's go ahead and actually play it. So we'll say :play, and then we want to listen for it to be completed. So we'll say .completed, :connect, create an anonymous function inside of here. And once the tween is finished, the last thing that we want to do is actually destroy that clone just like that. So we'll run through the entire animation, and then we'll go ahead and clean it up by destroying that clone once the animation has finished. And now if you're looking back at the animate click function and you forgot where we actually called it at because we don't use it anywhere in the script, remember, we use it inside of the starter player scripts, inside of the click local script. We actually use it right here. Now, it does show a red underline for me, but I think that if I reopen it, it should fix that. And yeah, once I reopen it, we can actually see that that function is valid. And if we click it, we go directly to that function. So now that's all working perfectly. With all that being said, let's hop into our game and actually test this out. So once we hop into our game, we can see that I have a random gift to collect. We'll go ahead and collect that. And now when I click on my screen, first we can actually see that the click animation is appearing. And we can see that those like 4 click icons are appearing and moving away from our cursor. So that's pretty cool. And then as we're actually earning clicks, we can also see that that pops up as well. And after a second or two, those fade away as well. So I feel like this is all looking pretty smooth. Of course, you might want it to look a little bit different, and if you do, then of course you can make any changes to it that you want to. But I think that we've gotten this to a pretty nice point. And hey, it only took about 68 episodes to get to this point. You know, it probably would have been a good idea to make this like a episode 2 or episode 3, but yeah, it only took a little while, like, you know, a year and a half, maybe a little bit longer to get to here. But hey, we finally did it, boys. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, with that being said, that's going to be it for this episode. As always, if you enjoyed the video, smash the like button. Feel free to visit MonzterDev or my Patreon. Links down below in the description to both of those. If you want to support me and gain access to all the scripts and the game file that we made during this episode, as well as a ton of other resources for easily developing your next Roblox game. Anyways, hopefully you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.